Chapter 2. The Big Hill. It had to be missed or Jessie would not even try it. If she failed, and so far she had always failed, she wanted no one else to know of it, especially her mother and father. She'd lost count of how many times she had lied to them about the big hill, about how she had made it all the way to the top. They mustn't see her. No one must see her. If she was going to fail again, then she would feel alone and unseen. Old Mr. Barney might see her, and probably often did as she passed his shack at the bottom of the big hill. But he'd be the only one, and besides, he wouldn't tell anyone. Mr. Barney kept himself to himself and minded his own business. He hardly ever spoke to a soul. Jessie was 10, and he had spoken to her maybe half a dozen times in her entire life. He would just wave at her through the window sometimes, but she was as sure as she could be that he would never spy on her. He just wasn't like that. There was smoke coming from his chimney, and one of the chickens stood cross-legged in the porch. But today, as Jessie walked across the clearing outside his shack, there was no sign of Mr. Barney. The mist cut the mountain off halfway up and dwarfed it, but Jessie knew what was waiting for her up there. How high it really was, how hard it was going to be, and was daunted by it all over again. Mole, her mother's black donkey, nudged her from behind. Mole would go with her. He went everywhere with her. More than once it had been Mole who had spoilt it, nudging her off balance at just the wrong moment. There was a lot that annoyed her about her lousy palsy, as she often called it. But it was balance that was the real problem. Once she'd fallen over, it took so much of her energy to get up again that there was little left for the big hill itself. If she could just keep her rhythm going, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. If she could just keep on lurching and not fall over, she knew that one day, someday, she'd have the strength enough to reach the top of the big hill, and that she'd never have to lie about it again. Mole rubbed his nose up against her back. "All right, Mole," she said, clutching the donkey's neck to steady herself. I'm going. It's all well for you. You've got 4 good legs. I've only got 2, and they won't exactly do what I tell them, will they?" She looked up at the big hill and took a deep breath. "I'm telling you, Mole, today's the day. I can feel it inside me." The donkey glanced at her and snorted. Jessie laughed. "Race you to the top by gears." She started well enough, leaning forward into the hill, willing her fumbling feet forward. She knew every rut and tussock of the track ahead. She'd sat down hard enough on most of them. Mole walked alongside her, browsing in the bracken. After a while he trotted on ahead, all tippy-toed, and disappeared into the mist. "Clever clogs," Jessie called after him. But then she tried all she could to put him out of her mind. She knew she had to concentrate. The path was wet from the mist and very slippery. One false step and she'd be on her bottom, and that would be that. Again. She could hear Mole snorting somewhere up ahead. As like as not, he'd be at the waterfall by now. Jessie had reached the waterfall just once. The week before. It was as high as she had ever gone on her own. That time too, her legs had let her down. They wouldn't manage the stones, and she'd tripped and fallen. She'd tried crawling, but she wasn't any better at crawling than she was at walking. She'd crawled on through the water, become so cold, and had to give up. But today would be different. Today she would not let herself give up. Today she would reach the top, no matter what. Today she would prove Mrs. Burke, to Marion Murphy, and to everyone else at school that she could climb the big hill just like they could. She could see Mole up ahead of her now, drinking in the pool below the waterfall. Jessie's legs ached. She wanted so much to stop, but she knew that she mustn't. That rhythm was everything. She passed Mole and laughed out loud at him. "Ha! Haven't you read the one about the hare and the tortoise?" she cried. "See you at the top." This was the spot where she'd come to grief the week before, the part of the track she most dreaded. The track rose steeply beside the waterfall, curling away out of sight and around the back of the hill. Every stone was loose, and until she reached the waterfall, if she reached the waterfall, the track would be more like a stream. The stones under her feet more like stepping stones. From now on, she would have to be careful. Very careful. She was standing now on the very rock where she tripped the last time. She punched the air with triumph and staggered on and up. She was in unknown territory now. Only on her father's back had she ever gone beyond this point, and that was a long time ago when she was small. She felt her legs weakening all the time. She fought them, forcing them on. She breathed in deep, drawing what strength she could from the air, and that was when the mist filled her lungs. She coughed and had to go on coughing. Still, she tried to go on. She felt herself falling and knew she could do nothing about it. She threw out her arms to save herself and was relieved to see she was falling into the water. She would be wet, but at least she wasn't going to hurt herself. But she hadn't accounted for the stones just beneath the surface of the water. She never even felt the cold of the stream as it covered her face. There was an explosion of pain inside her head and ringing in her ears that seemed as if it would never end. Then the world darkened suddenly around her. She tried to see through it, but she couldn't. She tried to breathe, but she couldn't. She was dreaming of her father's creature sculptures. They were all in the cottage, and Smiling was telling them a story, and they were laughing, cackling like witches. She woke suddenly. She was sitting propped up, her back against a boulder. Mole was grazing some way off, his tail whisking. Jessie's head throbbed. She put her hand to it. There was a lump between her fingers, and it was sticky with blood. There was more blood on her ears and on her cheeks too. She was soaked to the skin. She wondered for a few moments where she was and how she had got there. She remembered the climb up the big hill and how she had fallen. And then she realised she had failed yet again. Tears filled her eyes and she cried out loud. Her fists clenched, her eyes closed to stop the tears. She tasted the salt of her tears and brushed them away angrily. "I'll get there, Mrs. Burke," she shouted. "I'll get there. You'll see." From nowhere came a voice, a woman's voice, but almost low enough to be a man's. "Of course you will, Jessie," it said, "but not if you're sitting there feeling all sorry for yourself." Jessie looked around. There was no one there. Mole glanced at her quizzically. He had stopped chomping. For one silly moment, Jessie imagined it might have been Mole talking, but then the voice went on. "Ha! So you've a bit of a knock to your head. Are you going to let that stop you?" Mole was browsing again, tearing at the grass, so it couldn't be him talking. "I'm not that donkey, Jessie, and I'll tell you something else for nothing. There's no point in at all looking for me. You'll not find me. I'm just a voice. That's all. Don't go worrying about it." Who are you?" Jessie whispered, sitting up and wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Is that what they teach children these days? Can you not use a handkerchief like a proper person? Have you not got a handkerchief?" "Yes," said Jessie, looking around her, but frantically now. "Then use it, why don't you?" Jessie searched out her handkerchief and blew her nose. "That's better now," the voice went on. "I've always thought that you can tell a lot about folk from the way they treat their noses. There's pickers, there's wipers, like you, there's snifflers, and worst of all, there's trumpeters. You'll not believe this, but I knew a queen once, a real queen, mind you, I'm telling you, and she was a trumpeter. Worse still, she'd blow her nose on a handkerchief. And she wouldn't throw it away like you or me. She'd use it again. Honest, she would. She'd use the same hanky twice. Can you believe such a thing? And herself a queen. I told her straight, I said, there's no surer way to catch a cold and die than to use the same handkerchief twice. She was no one's fool, that queen. Oh, no. But she listened to me. She must have, because she lived on to a ripe old age, just like me. She died sitting up. Did you know that? Chuckling now, the voice seemed to be coming closer all the time. That queen, she wouldn't lie down for anyone, not even for death. A lady after my own heart she was. English, mind, but she couldn't help that now, could she? Listen, Jessie, are you just going to sit there, or are you going to get onto your feet and climb the big hill, like you said you would? Who are you? Jessie asked it again. She was hoping against hope that maybe she was still in bed and dreaming it all. But she was bleeding, and there was real blood on her fingers, on her head. So the voice had to be real too, unless she was going mad. That thought, that she might be going mad, had frightened Jessie above everything else. It doesn't matter who I am, said the voice, and it came from right beside her now, except that this is my hill you're walking on. I've been watching you these last few weeks. We all have, the boys and me. They didn't think you'd make it, but I did. I was sure of it, so sure of it that I put a bet on it. 5 gold doubloons. And Jessie, if there's one thing I hate losing, it's money. And here you are, sitting there like a puddle, crying your eyes out and wiping your nose in the back of your hand. I'm ashamed of you, Jessie. I'm sorry, said Jessie. I didn't mean to. And so you should be. I'll tell you what, the voice was whispering in her ear. I'll make it worth your while. I'll leave a little something for you at the top of the hill. But if you want my little something, then you'll have to go up and fetch it there for yourself. How about it? Jessie was still thinking about what she should do when she felt strong arms under her shoulders, lifting her onto her feet, and then holding her for a moment until she steadied herself on her legs. Then someone tapped her bottom. On you go, girl. And Jessie found herself walking on, almost without meaning to, as if her legs were being worked by someone else. She looked behind her and again to see if someone was there. But there was no one there. Only Mole ambling along, head lowered, ears back. Did you hear her? Jessie whispered as Mole came alongside. She's watching us. I know she is. Come on, Mole. We've got to get to the top of the hill. We've got to. And she lurched on up the big hill, rejoining the track beyond the waterfall. The grass under her feet was spongy here. Easier walking, easier falling too, she thought. She remembered how her father had galloped her on his back along the same grassy path, and how they'd fallen over and rolled down the hill together and into the bracken. She remembered too the rock-strewn gully ahead, and she wondered if she was ever going to get past it. She went down on her hands and knees. It would be painful and slow, but there was only one way. There were brambles across the path that had been pulled back, endlessly lacerating the rocks to be negotiated. Jessie kept crawling until her wrists couldn't take any more, and she had to crawl on her elbows. That was when her knee slipped and her fingers couldn't grasp, and she slid backwards. She ended up in an ungainly heap wedged against the rocks, knees and elbows barked and bleeding, and a vicious thorn stuck in the palm of her hand. She drew it out with her teeth and spat it on the ground. Mole was braying at her from somewhere further up the hill. Jessie looked up, shielding her eyes against the white of the sun that was breaking now through the mist. Mole was standing right at the top of the big hill. He wasn't just calling her, he was taunting her. Jessie levered herself laboriously to her feet and swayed there for a moment. Her head was spinning. She closed her eyes, and then all came flooding back. April, the start of the summer term at school, and they'd all gone, even the infants, up the big hill on a nature walk with Mrs. Burke. her head teacher, and the other bane of her life besides Marion Murphy. And Jessie had been the only one to be left behind with Miss Jefferson, the infant teacher. Miss Jefferson had insisted on holding her hand all the way to the beach, just in case, she said. They were going to find lots of interesting things, she said, to make a shell picture. It was always shells or wildflowers with Mrs. Jefferson. She had her own wildflower meadow behind the school, but today it was shells. Miss Jefferson foraged through the bladderwrack and the sea lettuce, whooping with joy every few seconds and talking 19 to the dozen like she always did. It wasn't that Jessie didn't like her. She did. She was forever fussing over her, endlessly anxious that Jessie might fall, might be too cold, might be too tired. Jessie was used to that. She was used to her, but it was being left behind that she really resented. Despite all Miss Jefferson's enthusiastic encouragement, she could not bring herself to care a fig about a shell picture. She wanted to be up there with them, with the others. All the while she kept her eye on the big hill. She could see them, a trail of children up near the summit now, Miss Burke striding on ahead. She heard the distant cheer when they reached the top, and she had to look away. Miss Jefferson understood and put her arm around her, but it was no comfort. She begged to be allowed up the big hill with the others, but Mrs. Burke wouldn't even hear of it. "You'd slow us down, Jessie," she said, "and besides, you know you'll never reach the top." And then she laughed. "I'm afraid you're far too big to carry." That was the moment when Jessie had decided that she would climb the big hill, cerebral lousy palsy or not. Somehow or other, she would do it. She would drag herself up there, if necessary. She opened her eyes, and here she was, after 2 months of trying, within a stone's throw of the summit. This time, there'd be no stopping her. "Here I come," she cried. "Here I come!" And she launched herself up the hill. Several times, her legs refused to do what she told them, and threatened to buckle beneath her. Time and again she felt her head reeling. She longed to sit down and rest, but again she heard the voice in her head. "You can do it, girl. You can do this. Come on." Where were the words coming from? Or who spoke them? She neither knew nor cared any more. Nothing mattered but getting to the top. She was almost there when her legs simply folded on her, and she found herself on her knees. She crawled the last metre or so over the soft thrift and then collapsed. Mole came over to her and nuzzled her neck with his warm whiskery nose. She clung to Mole's mane and hauled herself up onto her feet. There below her lay the whole of Clare Island and all around the green sea, with the island of Inishturk far to the south. And then she turned her face into the wind. There was the mainland and the islands of Clew Bay floating in the sea like distant dumplings. She was on top of the world. She lifted her hands to the sky and laughed out loud into the wind, the tears running down her face. Mole looked on, each of his ears turning independently. Jessie's legs collapsed and she sat down with a sudden jolt that knocked the breath out of her for a moment and stunned her into sanity. Only then did she begin to reflect on all that had happened to her on the big hill that morning. There could be no doubt that she had made it to the top, unless, of course, she was still in the middle of some wonderful dream. But the more she thought, the more she began to doubt her memory of the climb, and the fall into the stream, the disembodied voice that kept speaking to her, the arms that had helped her onto her feet, the words in her head that urged her on to the top. It could all have been some extraordinary hallucination. That would make sense, but then what about the bumping of her head? There was something else she couldn't understand. Someone must have rescued her from the stream, but who? Maybe it was all the bump on the head. Maybe that was why she was hearing voices, and maybe that was why her memory was deceiving her. She had to be sure, really. She had to test it. "Hello," she ventured softly. "Are you still there?" I did it, didn't I? I won your bet for you. Are you there? There was no one. Nothing except a solitary humming bumblebee, a pair of gulls wheeling overhead, and Mole munching something nearby. Jessie went on. Are you anyone? Are you someone? Are you just a bump in the head or what? Are you real? Say something, please. But no one said anything. Something rustled behind her. Jenny swung round and saw a rabbit scuttling away into the bracken, its white tail bobbing. She noticed there were rabbit droppings all over the summit. She flicked at one of them and it bounced off the side of a rock, a giant granite rock, shaped by the wind and the weather into a perfect bowl. And in the bowl was a pool of shining water, fed by a stream from above it. Jessie hadn't been thirsty until now. She crawled over, grasped the lip of the rock and hauled herself up. She put her mouth into the water like Mole did and drank deep. Water had never been so welcome to her as it was that morning on the summit of the big hill. She was wiping her mouth when she saw something glinting at the bottom of the pool. It looked like a large ring. Brass, maybe, like one of the curtains they had at home in the sitting room. She reached into the water and picked it out. I am a woman of my word, the voice said from somewhere behind her. Didn't I say I'd leave a little something for you? In her exhaustion, in her triumph, Jessie had quite forgotten about the promise of a little something. She backed herself against the rock. Don't be alarmed, Jessie. I'll not harm you. I've never hurt a single soul that didn't deserve it. You did a fine thing today, Jessie. A fine thing. And what's better still, you've won me my wager. I'm now 5 gold doubloons richer. Not that I have a lot to spend it on, mind. None of us have. But that's the by and by. None of the boys thought you could do it, but I did. And I like to be right. It's a family feeling of ours. Her mother's an O'Malley, I told them. So Jessie's half an O'Malley. She'll do it. Just you watch. And we did watch. And you did do it. The earring's yours, girl. To be honest with you, I've not a lot of use for such things these days. Look after it now, won't you? When Jessie spoke at last, her voice was more of a whisper than she intended it to be. Where are you? Can't I see you? You can't be just a voice. But there was no reply. She tried again and again, until she knew that whoever had been there either didn't want to answer out or had gone away. Thanks for the earring, Jessie called out. I won't lose it, I promise. It should have sounded silly talking to no one like she was, but somehow it didn't. Talking to Mole was silly and she knew it, but there was no one else and she had to talk to someone. See what she gave me, Mole. It's an earring. It's because I climbed the big hill and won her bet. The donkey lifted his upper lip, showed his yellow teeth, and sniffed suspiciously at the ring in the flat of Jessie's hand. He decided it wasn't worth eating. Jessie looked back down the big hill. It was a very long way down. She had never given a single thought as to how she would get down if she ever were to get to the top. Probably because in her heart of hearts she had never really believed she would get to the top. She knew well enough that for her, climbing down the stairs at home was always a more difficult proposition than climbing up. She'd never manage it, not all the way down to the bottom. It was impossible. Then she had an idea. An obvious one, but a good one. Mole would take her down. She would use the rock as a mounting block, lie over Mole's back and hitch a ride all the way back home. Easy peasy. It did not prove as easy as she imagined, however. First of all, Mole wouldn't come to the rock that had to be dragged there by his mane. Then he wouldn't stand still, not at first. Mole wasn't at all used to being ridden and shifted nervously under Jessie's weight. But eventually he seemed to get the idea and walked away, taking Jessie down the big hill all the way back home. Jessie clinging on like a limpet, desperate not to slide off. She waited until Mole was grazing on the grass on the lawn in amongst her father's creatures, then just dropped off. It was a fairly painless landing. That was where her father found her when he came back from the sheep field after a short time. "Didn't you see me, Dad?" she said. He stared at her in horror. "There's blood all over you, Jessie," he said, running over to her. "What have you been up to?" "I did it, Dad. I climbed the big hill. Mo broke me back, but I did the rest all on my own." "I thought you climbed it already," her dad said. In her excitement, Jessie had forgotten her own lies. "Well, I did," she said, recovering quickly. "I did, but I did it faster this time." Her father carried her inside, sat her down in the kitchen. "What do you want to go and do crazy things like that for?" he said, dabbing her grazed knees with wet cotton wool. It should have stung, but it didn't. "Your mother will kill me letting you go off like that. Don't say a word when she gets back to you, hear me? And just look at the lump on your head." Jessie clutched the earring tight in her fist. The sheepdog was sniffing at it. "Get off, Panda," she said, pushing him away. Panda gazed up at her out of his 2 white eyes and rested his wet chin on her knee. By the smell of him, he'd been rolling on something nasty again. "When Mum gets back," Jess went on. "This evening, if the weather holds," said her father, pressing a cold tea towel to her head. "Here, hold that. It'll get the swelling down. He's arrived, your cousin Jack. Your mum rang from the airport at Shannon." "What's he like?" Jessie said. Panda was trying to lick his way into her fist. She pushed him away again. "Quiet, doesn't say much. Makes a change from you, won't it?" "All summer," Jessie protested. "Why does he have to come all summer?" "Because he's a relation. He's your Uncle Sean's son. Your cousin. But I've never even met Uncle Sean." Her father lifted her arm to examine her elbow. She pulled away. "I'll wash it myself," she snapped. "What's the matter, Jessie?" he said, crouching down beside her. "I just wish he didn't have to come, Dad," she said. I like it like it is. It's just the 3 of us." "Me too," said her dad. "But we'll be 3 again enough after he's gone, won't we?" "Soon. Now, get upstairs and wash that elbow of yours. We don't want to go and poison us on us. Your mum will have 50 fits." Jessie had already thought where she would hide the earring before she even reached her room. The goldfish bowl. She'd hide it in the stones at the bottom of Barry's bowl. Barry went mad while she was doing it. He always hated her putting her hand on his bowl. "Look after it for me, Barry," she said, and the goldfish mouthed at her from under his wispy weed and then turned his tail on her. "Please yourself then," she said. All the while Panda was in her room, watching her intently. "Shh! Secret," she said, putting her fingers to her lips. "No one must ever know. Just you and me and Barry. He's not telling anyone, and neither are you." "Are you?" "Oh, you stink, Panda. Do you know that?" And that's the end of chapter 2. See you soon.